Well, this is where Bloom came in. And he said, what is the ideal? What's the gold standard of teaching? And that would be the one-to-one situation, right? If you've tutored somebody, taught them one-to-one, taught your children, like I do, you get to know exactly where they struggle and what they can do, and you don't waste their time, and you give them as long as they need. And if it doesn't work, you try something else. So, if that's the gold standard here, right, where everybody's kind of got to the criterion, and this is where we generally accept as partial success. What he's looking for, this mastery learning, is something there. It's not going to be as good with 30 children as with one-to-one, is it? And that's realistic. But it could be most of the way there. And the research you'll see suggests that that is achievable. So the system that he came up with, like almost 50 years ago, and you'll hear Mark talking about it for maths, the same thing, is this. There's a bit more to it, but roughly speaking, you have your mastery objectives, which need to be really clear. You teach towards them. You've got to give the students the maximum opportunity to learn. And then, after the initial teaching, you put in place a well-designed short assessment. You call it a quiz. If you read Dylan Williams' books on embedded formative assessment, he recommends multiple choice type quiz, which can be very well designed such that you can test whether kids have got what you want or they've got some misconception, and you can do it very fast. You get that evidence, but you haven't finished the topic. You're still somewhere in the middle. You have a chance to do something about it. So you've got two possibilities for each student. Either they didn't get everything, or they did. And if they didn't, like poor old James, then they go down the relearn path. And that relearn is a bit like going to the doctor. You tell them your symptoms, what's wrong, and they give you a prescription what to do. So teaching turns into an individualized prescription of things that might help you get to the right understanding. And then, of course, you really want to know whether they did get it. So you need a follow-up quiz or something similar to the first one for that student to feel motivated and confident and for you to know. But then there's going to be quite a lot of students like Josh and everybody else, hopefully, if you've done a really good job, who are ready to move on. So you need to know what's the next stage. And that doesn't mean going on to a new topic. That means going more in depth into the same ideas, being able to apply and extend them to other situations, use higher level thinking. Because after all, that's what the GCSEs are going to demand, isn't it? With AO2 and AO3, you can't just stop on knowing stuff. So what is the evidence for mastery working in that system? These are some broad conclusions. And you'll find this on the EEF, Education Endowment Foundation website as a summary too. So pretty big effect size. 5 months extra learning per year is a large effect from decades of mastery learning research. However, it is all old. It fell out of fashion, so most of the data comes from the 70s and 80s. But it's pretty comprehensive, and it's almost like people felt, well, we've done this now, we've proved it, there's no need to do any more research. We could just figure out the nuances. But there are some problems, of course. The first one being, as you can imagine, there's a lot of preparation required. You've got to figure out all these routes and prepare the material. And you've got to manage what's going on, which could be quite complex in the classroom. And that might be one reason why teachers didn't carry on with these programs, and you don't see them anymore. There is another issue here, which is rather more complex about curriculum planning. because Bloom said, if you get mastery early on with the basics, over time, those differences in speed that you saw with the 3 learners will reduce, and it won't take so much extra time for James. He'll turn into a quite good learner eventually. And so your job will become easier. But then that was queried, and there's mixed research findings on that question. And when this has been done more recently with students who are doing really badly, and these researchers came in and said, look, we'll show you how it's done. They managed to get them to the right level, but it took them 3 times as long. So you can imagine there's going to be some issues there with finishing what you've started. We'll come back to that. What I'm going to do, though, is to go through these 5 factors. These are the factors in those mastery research experiments that were found to be critical. Those are the 5 parts of the model, and we'll look at them in the context of science. Now, if you look at that, you probably think, well, I might be doing that already, or some of that. And there's lots of initiatives nowadays, because mastery is rather old, that have tried to kind of almost take its place. So I need to show you what these are. And in particular, let's look at AFL and see what the differences really are, or whether you're just doing this stuff naturally. So how many of you have heard of the growth mindset? Put your hands up. Everybody has. Are you doing it? Kind of. What's the connection with mastery? Well, it's a similar philosophy, isn't it? But it doesn't, of course, tell you how to do that, except to reward effort. But it's not really a systematic approach to formative assessment. We'll come back to AFL. Response to intervention. You may not know this. This is what they do in the States for special ed. We have some screening programs now in the UK, like phonics, to see early on which children are likely to struggle later. It's trying to anticipate problems before they really become a problem, and then put students on different tracks and give extra support, different levels of support to the ones who are likely to need it. That's clever, isn't it? Instead of waiting till kids fail, you build in your support at the beginning. So that has got a lot of overlap with mastery. The flipped classroom, anyone doing that here? 1, 2, great. Very popular. That's using technology to change the learning environment. And of course, you can see how that would give students extra time and different ways of learning. But it's not necessarily the same thing, because it can be just used to, get kids watching videos of the explanations before they come to the lesson, which is hardly the same. Maths mastery is probably the thing you know, because it's happening everywhere in maths. But it isn't mastery most of the time, as Mark will tell you later. It is a collection of teaching methods, mostly exported from the Far East, that we are now adopting in primary schools. But they're not mastery in that sense of changing the assessment and the follow-up learning. So let's look at AFL, because that's the closest thing to mastery. And AFL comes from Dylan William and Paul Black's work, and it's very widely used. When they wrote their paper, they indeed referred to mastery learning as a system for AFL, which it is. So the two are really complementary, and you can be doing both of them. So there's not a sense of one or the other. And here is a kind of comparison, this is my comparison, on 4 different factors to show some of the differences. But they aren't massive. So most of the AFL guidance you get is in-the-moment stuff, using questions to probe understanding and see what to do next, right? That's the kind of core Dylan Williams message. And that's essential, of course, but that's not what mastery is focusing on. It assumes that you're doing that, but what it's doing is looking at the success of your initial teaching, and if it didn't work, what's the follow-up? You see the difference. It's a different time scale. How does it work? there's a difference here as well. AFL is very much part of the ongoing teaching, whereas mastery sort of fits around it. This is the sort of level at which you're operating. If you're in a class teaching and interacting, then basically you have to decide where to go next for the whole class. You're not individualizing your instruction, but mastery focuses on the individual, because once you know what the problems are, they're going to all be different for different students, and you need different ways to solve them. And finally, there's a slight difference in what you do next after you've got that information. Typically, you might carry on if the students are getting it, or not, you go back. And here, you've got some fairly well formal routes. Extend, you've got particular activities. Relearn, you've got other activities. So it's kind of a lot of preparation on this end.